let me give you each 30 seconds each to summarize the key takeaway that the audience needs from this from this and the video that they'll be watching afterwards. Caroline, you
We're here to grow things, not build things.
We're here to grow things, not build things. I like that. That's a very interesting. Oh, that's going to keep me up tonight. Darren, key takeaway.
I think don't underestimate kind of the role of a solutions architect and make sure that there is integration across the business. I think that's where, at least as an AWS solutions architect, that's what we try to do for our customers. And it's worked quite well so far. So happy to have further on discussions.
Fantastic. Amy?
I would say being data-driven isn't just about the data. In fact, the data is broadly irrelevant.
Shots fired. Shots fired. I love that. Aled.
Doing this stuff well is not going to be the responsibility of any one team or one group within the business. It really involves a lot of collaboration, a lot of stakeholders coming together with a shared vision. And that's hard to achieve, but well worth getting that buy-in from lots of people.
I would like to present Amy with the unofficial first place prize for mic drop moment and winning the internet today. Good day, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Frank Conn-Sullivan. I am going to be your host, moderator, and chair for this amazing panel that we've put together today. Today's topic is not about being cool with these sunglasses. Yes, I wish I could turn them off, but I'm just going to have to own that now. Today's topic is about being data-driven with an AWS focus. Now, to start off with, I'd like you all to tell me, where have you dialed in from today? I'm currently in London. I don't need sunglasses. It's grey, rainy, with a chance of meatballs. Imran from South Wales. That's very good. You'll find a little chat box down here. Luxembourg. Okay, Eduardo's winning for the furthest distance. Susie from Peru. I think Susie's in the lead. Susie Demet from Peru. Oh my goodness. Paul Hardman. Now there's a name I recognize. A very wet Cork. Well, Cork boy right here. And there's another member of the Cork Mafia here on the panel as well. We like that very much. Mustafa Kaya from Ankara. Merhaba, hoş geldiniz. Carmen. Buenos dias. Alex from the Scottish borders. I'll pass that one to Aled because I don't know any Scots Gaelic. UAE. That's very cool. Very cool. Bom dia, buenos dias, bonjour, salamu alaikum. Cool. All right, let's get started. Does anybody know where this castle is? Could be Croatia. Could be a McMansion in Florida. Imran's got it. Imran's got it. This is Edinburgh Castle. Now, this is the view from the office window, actually. It's a little bit of a Scottish theme. We're a Scottish company. Cloudsoft is an advanced AWS partner and our corporate overlord for today, but I promise that will not harm the editorial independence and content of this. Today's topic is data-driven on AWS. So, to kick us off, data-driven has kind of lost its meaning. It's bandied about by a lot of marketeers, unfortunately, people like me. It's become diluted to the point where the words just don't really make sense. They don't really ring true. What does data-driven even mean? We know that organizations have an awful lot of data, the amount of money going into data storage and data analytics and really trying to monetize or valorize the data. It's increasing. A lot of the data that we have made for organizations has been made in the last 2 or 3 years. It's growing exponentially. And 97% of the data that organizations hold is unused, whether it's structured, semi-structured, unstructured data, it's unused. And the real issue is making use of it effectively within the context of business. Of course, as much as I'd love to be a late night chat show host, which I do believe is my future calling. This is not the Frank Sullivan Show. This is about me asking the experts and guiding and creating knowledge, where we're going to ask 3 questions. What does data-driven mean? Why is there this widening gap between the business and, the tech team? And then what can we do practically to try and reduce that gap? How do we get back to a good place of outcomes? And really, through the solutions architecture or the data architect lens, how can we take some of those strategies back into our day-to-day business today? So you've all proven to me that you're not asleep at the wheel driving whilst trying to watch this webinar. You've used the chat box. That's good. Why is that good? We want this to be interactive. I'm going to be fielding questions as we go along. Ludo, our VP of Operations, is moonlighting as the chat moderator. Ludo, do you want to say hi in the chat box? He may even come on camera. He has the most gorgeous beagle. I know some of you might not be dog people, but he has a beagle called Peanut, who, when the camera first loaded, he was actually the first attendee. And I thought, my goodness, Ludo, you've turned into a... No, of course I didn't think that. Let me introduce you to the amazing panel that we have today. Alan Sage, VP of Engineering. Some have described him as a lover. Some have described him as a fighter. I would describe him as everything in between for his customers. Caroline Zimmerman, a real pro on data product and data strategy. She's the data strategy director at Profusion. Amy Bulman, one of our most recent additions to the panel, and Cork native, the data governance expert and also a data product specialist at Zeiss Group. So if any of you have glasses, care about satellites in space, or maybe even the cameras on your phone, she'll know all about that too. And last but not least, Darren Coe, Senior Solutions Architect from AWS themselves. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm going to give you 30 seconds each to introduce yourself and your background. Aled, do you want to go first?
Sure. So Aled Sage, I have a very technical background. I came from a software development, product development side, but the last 6 years, I've really been focused on helping other customers to build their products and use AWS better through services, consulting, whether that's migration, modernization, and increasingly with data projects to help people get real business value from AWS.
Thank you. Caroline?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Caroline. So in my role as data strategy and products director at Profusion, my job is really to make sure that whatever engineering we do or data viz that we do or analysis that we do, data science, that it does deliver ROI or some other measurable version of value. And before that, I started and led the data team at BMG, which is a big music company.
Thank you, Caroline. Amy?
Hi, I'm Amy Bulman. I'm currently working in data governance for the Zeiss Group, and my main responsibility there is overseeing a portfolio of data quality and standard-related initiatives, making sure that we map the data needs to the business requirements and ensuring that we prioritize the right projects. Historically, I've worked as a data analyst and product manager in various industries, various types of company, and I'm very excited to be here.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, Darren Coe, the man who needs no introduction, but I'm going to ask anyway.
Very, very generous of you, Frank. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Darren. So I'm a solutions architect at AWS, helping customers get onboarded with AWS and achieve success using our many, many services. I have a bit of a background in machine learning, having worked with some public sector organizations prior to working at AWS, and just, again, happy to be here. So thanks very much.
Great. So this is a credible panel. The very first thing that I like to do with all of my victims, I mean attendees, is to make sure that we've got credible and balanced expertise. This is a learning environment. Controversy is encouraged, but respectfully. So anybody who doesn't follow the rules, out you go, James Bond style. We're going to start off with a little warm-up exercise here. How do you make your decisions? This is something for all of you. A poll is going to pop up on your screen in 3, 2, 1. Can you all see those questions? The panelists will be able to see the results and I'll share them. The first question now, and obviously DALL-E and ChatGPT has done a reasonable job of generating these images. When it comes to decision making, do you feel that your teams are data-driven, like to achieve consensus? They're more like the first image? Or is there a bit of demagoguery and we follow by cult of personality, or those that shout the loudest tend to build conviction and you go with your gut? And then the second question, does it feel like your organization is data-driven? Not a question, not a value judgment on whether it is or isn't. What does it feel like on a day-to-day basis? To get the best out of this 1 hour session, I need you to think with your head and your heart. What does it feel like when you're making decisions? I'll give it another 30 seconds and then I'll share the results. All right, keep your answers there. I'll let you change them because I'm going to do a little switcheroo here, right? It's not all rosy. You may feel that option A is the right way to go, but sometimes there's too much data. Sometimes you just can't make sense of it. Does this image in this context then feel like consensus or analysis paralysis and nothing ever gets done in a highly matrixed organization? And then the other one, what may appear to be aggressive demagoguery, maybe it's not nearly as extreme as this. Maybe this guy is just rehearsing for a play and it's actually a clear vision that everyone can articulate. Let's jump into part one, right? Nearly 3/4 of you have said consensus with data is how you and your teams make decisions. And yet 4% have said, WTF does data-driven even mean? 1/4 has said, no, your organization doesn't feel data-driven. And overwhelmingly, 62% of you have said that you're only partially data-driven. 12% of you have said that you feel that your organization is data-driven. 12% out of 26 people who've done this poll. That's telling. So let's get to the nuts and bolts of the issue here. What is the meaning of data-driven? Caroline, would you start us off?
Sure. I mean, I think you and I, Frank, were talking about this earlier, but I've come to care a lot less about data-driven because I don't think that CEOs are necessarily, like, CEOs care about growth, not data. And like, as long as they're hitting the numbers and hitting the growth plan, they don't really care about data. I think it's more around, are you using the information at your disposal to grow as profitably as you can be? And oftentimes the data that you need for that is not the data sitting in your, we don't use 99% of it. It's probably like sitting in people's heads or very incompletely captured in Salesforce. So less data, but more meaningful data enriched with people's insights is probably more of what's needed, not, just more of the automated, data exhaust stuff.
As much as I find your pragmatism refreshing, I feel that there may be a little bit of a mismatch for what people on that journey towards being data-driven means. Amy, we kind of talked about evidence-based decisioning as a more accurate term. How would you characterize the decision-making in your current role and through the context of data quality?
So I think when thinking about data quality and broadly accessing the right kind of data, it's really not about having a huge volume of data, a huge volume of dashboards, because like you previously described, that can just lead to decision paralysis, fatigue in terms of trying to extrapolate meaningful information from these hundreds of data points, millions of data points, potentially millions of dashboards. So what we really focus on is the right data, the right context to the right people to enable them to make better decisions based on their expertise, the expertise of people within their team, but also with a view to having the right data available to them in a way that's meaningful to them. I think that's quite important, but maybe doesn't necessarily reflect the classical interpretation of data-driven, which is where it can sometimes lead to a bit of miscommunication between management and operational level people, because there is an expectation that we should only use data. But a lot of my job is actually pulling back from that, somewhat ironically, because it's the right data that's the most important thing.
Darren, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I think it's quite cultural as well to the organization that you're working in, particularly around, to Caroline's point around CEO, C-suite being very focused on profit. That is still a data point, and I think it's interesting to see how different organizations trickle down that viewpoint from the C-suite at the very top down to the operational teams below. I think just having worked at AWS for many years, there was this culture of being data-driven. But actually, how does that reflect from a day-to-day perspective on the very front lines from a very operational point of view versus what does the CEO see as a summary report? I think it's interesting to dive into that.
We'll pick Amazon as an example then, where it's a well published quote from your CEO that the most junior person should be able to override the most senior person if they have the data. Looking at the temperance between Amy and Caroline's answers, Amy is the before, Caroline is the after. We're missing the during part of the decision-making process. Caroline working with C-suites and the executive, she's probably right. They don't care about the data, they care about the outcome. But Amy's also right in the before phase of making decisions, making sure that the inputs and the data points and the models are capable of giving you that sort of parameters or that measurement for success is also really important. Now, if that's the before and the after the decision, what does the messy middle of decision making look like for your clients?
So I think on that journey, it's important that people are as honest as they can be about what data they're really acting upon. It's far too common for those decision makers and C-suite folk to cherry pick the data to justify their gut feel. Like they go seeking out data that backs up what they believe rather than that challenges what that is. I think also we're always going to operate in a world where we have messy data, where we have impartial information. And one of the key things is how do we operate as a business in a way that can course correct as we discover that new information. So I'm a huge fan of Eric Ries's The Lean Startup. And that's about how do I get real feedback? How do I course correct the products I'm building? How do I make sure I don't need to spend 6 months building a working system, putting it in the hands of the customers, and then finding out that wasn't actually what they wanted? So I think there's a whole bunch of stuff around how does a business operate such that you can course correct as new data becomes available, as you test your hypothesis, and as you improve your data quality to be able to make those bigger decisions within the market.
I think that's a very interesting point around, are there frameworks for making good decisions that involve both instinct and data, and which are you more weighted to one side or the other? It's not really a binary problem. I think the lean startup example is a great example of have a hypothesis, validate your assumptions, run the experiment, and that becomes the proof point. John has made an interesting point on chat here. He just says data-driven results are more believable. Yes, they are. But if the measurement framework isn't right or isn't relevant, then how do you know you're just driving the car in the fog? Let me move this back more towards the sort of data theory side. Data consumers versus data producers. Is that an artificial construct or is it useful? Caroline?
Maybe just before I answered that, I was just reflecting on what people are saying. And I guess I didn't mean at all that being data-driven isn't important. I think it's just that data-driven isn't the goal. Like growing profitably is the goal, and data can help you do that. And I think that often data teams assume that data is important to that, or just maybe not taking that. I'm working on a piece of research at the moment on how private equity firms are leveraging data to increase enterprise value. And private equity is very razor focused. If they're going to do any data thing, it's because they think it's going to make the company more valuable. And what's really interesting is like the data leaders that I interviewed in PE are much more value focused than any data people I've ever met, like outside of PE. And they all see their role, like someone said, my role or my job is to grow things, not build things. The role is to deliver growth, not deliver data stuff. And I guess I just wanted to clarify that that's what I meant. It's just making sure that you put the cart, that you don't put the cart before the horse. And data doesn't come before growth. It's growth first, and then how does data enable that? On data consumers and producers, I guess I just often think that they're the same people. You know, we work a lot building like data solutions for sales team enablement. And so if you think of dealers at a car company, for example, they are both going to be consuming data, like a propensity model, for example, on who they should target, or like a churn model on who they should try and retain. But they're also producing that data because it's all coming from Salesforce data, for example. And I think that often data producers don't make great are not careful about data quality because they don't see the value of it. And if you can show them as data consumers that like how there's a value delivery at the end of that effort, then you're much more likely to get people to put high quality data in. And I would just say that on that, we worked with a client, it was a luxury automotive company, and they had incentivized dealers to like do better data entry in their bonuses. And it led to all these people, like all these dealers entering Mickey Mouse records. There were like 500 customers called Mickey Mouse because they were incentivized to do data entry, but they hadn't really thought about how they were going to control for that quality. So you don't want it to be like stick. You really want it to be carrot, and the carrot is giving them the value as data consumers of the data that they are inputting as producers.
You're such a classy strategy director not to name and shame this client. My God, wouldn't we all like to know?
I'm keen to
Amy.
kind of, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, hang on. I want Amy to pick up on this one. What if you're making decisions based on data that you don't access or have any control over? Like if you had to report on overall data quality across what is a very complex organization that you're running, but you have no control over the inputs. What kind of mismatch does that create? And does it breed resentment between the decision makers consuming the data and the producers who just don't care? Or don't even know that they're a data producer or a data steward?
I think the lack of knowledge and the lack of knowing where the data quality is an issue is inherently problematic, because the consumers of data don't always necessarily know where the data quality is going to be bad. They can identify certain things based on their understanding and how they use the data, but in a lot of cases, they actually miss more significant issues further down the chain on the side of the data producers. And naturally, from a data quality perspective, you want to shift towards the producers having more responsibility for data quality as much as possible, but without being able to articulate and understand that, without having someone cutting through in this vertical way, it's actually impossible to articulate that well, because there's just so many different needs, so many different operating models that exist within that. And I think, like, to pick up on what Carolyn said, I think that it's important to have a carrot, but I think it's also important to have a stick to actually think about this data quality and what it means for you as a consumer and a producer as a series of chains and a series of handoffs, because there is no easy way to connect the consumer at the very end and the producer at the very start together. You have to think about all of these interactions that happen throughout it.
I think there's also an element of intellectual honesty as well. How many executives can, search through Gartner, no matter what their hypothesis is, they'll find something to support it, then do a 180 on the decision and still go back to Gartner just to find a counter argument. To round off on this, we've talked about the before, the during, the after of the decision-making process, that sort of bridge between who's producing, who's consuming the data, and how that feeds into decision-making. Darren, round us off here. You and Aled have got many different hats working in a sort of professional services function, but the solutions architect view is really why we're here. On a given day, where let's say you have a more mature enterprise customer use case, and going back to your day job, how many different hats must you have to wear on a daily basis?
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair question. I think it really comes down to the kind of integration that a solutions architect has within the role of advisor to the customer, advisor to the technical teams, kind of interface with some of the business or product teams as well. I think that there's a role to be played, or the solutions architect has a very unique role to be played between all of those parties. And talking to Caroline's point around, data monetization and driving enterprise value, customers are now increasingly coming to me and trying to talk about data as a product. So either as an internal user or an external user, how are we getting value from that? And then focusing on particularly around Amy's point around data quality, trends around how do we track data lineage? How do we collect metadata on our existing data and actually make that relevant and improve the context of the insights we're trying to gather? These are all interesting trends. But yeah, as a solutions architect, sometimes it's a tough place. You have to provide value to many different stakeholders.
You have a future career in politics, my friend. For those of us who don't speak solutions architect, I'm going to say that Darren has 5 hats.
Thank you.
Let me pause there for 30 seconds and ask you guys to come back to the chat bot here. Are we going in the right direction here, right? You've reflected or taken an hour out of your busy day, and we're very grateful for that, to think about the role of data being data-driven, yourself, your teams. We've talked about data consumers and producers. And now Darren has just uncorked what could happily be an entire day workshop on, is it data product or data as a product? So just take 30 seconds here, pop a comment in the chat box, let us know if we're going in the right direction, if you want us to slow it down or speed it up a bit. Should be a tumbleweed or a loading icon available. Okay, good. We're going in the right direction. Part 2, right? There's the business and there's the techies. In one way or another, this kind of clique persists, or this clique mentality. And we think that that gap is just widening and widening between those that have the data and those that don't. Those that are interested in the data and those who really just don't care. Those that want to be data-driven, but are the systems and tools and ways of working are holding them back, versus those that are really, bright, shiny examples within their organization of how they're not just using things like the lean startup to plan for the unknown or build new things, but using really good frameworks for reporting and playing back, this is the objective reality, or this is the success and the KPIs behind a use case or a project. Aled, start us off here. When we talk about the widening gap between data and technology and the consumers or the business users, do you feel that that gap is widening or shrinking?
So I wonder whether the gap is just becoming more evident. When we think about the difference between the business and the technical folk, like there's always been a big gap there, like people treating IT as though it's a cost center rather than enabler for the business. The techie saying, well, give me the requirements and I will implement it. And I think data has sort of changed that story a bit, but it's made that gap more evident, because instead of going, give me your requirements and I will implement it, it's like the requirements for what data is needed is quite unclear. Like, we want to be able to answer any future question that C-suite are asking. We're not quite sure what there's going to be. We're not quite sure which data to collect, and we end up collecting way too much of it with poor data quality and so on. So yeah, there's a new gap forming compared to what there was, but I wonder if instead of saying this is wider, it's just more evident in the space.
All right. Darren, you've got one foot in both camps, don't you?
Yeah, I see interesting perspectives from both the business and the technical side the table. I think it's one of those things where actually the understanding, or kind of the logic, the actual business logic around how to use data is evident in all kind of parties at the table. And then it becomes that language, that comprehension or that literacy that we've also got here on the slide, of how do we tap into that? How do we actually extract value? Is that through SQL queries? Is that through using, say, a Gen AI chatbot, or using that to build queries into the data itself? I find it really interesting that there's data is valuable, and I think there's a lot of motivation to make the most of it. But actually, technology itself is evolving to make that easier for everyone to access. So whether you can write a SQL query or not is another thing, but how you'd want to interrogate that data if you had it. Yeah.
Well, I think we've got a mix of enterprise data leaders and more smaller and mid-market leaders and practitioners on the call today. So let's kind of, determine with those two, they're two different kind of needs, right? You could have a world-class enterprise organization that has the latest technology, but I've opened up a ticket and that ticket has bounced around 20 people, 3 countries. I once did my own little cost analysis. I needed my team at a previous company to create an IAM user for a contractor.
Yep.
That request took 9 weeks, and I estimated that ticket, right, a job that any one of us on this call could do in 30 seconds flat. It took 9 weeks. I estimated that little ticket cost over $30,000 in wasted time. The amount of time, 9 teams, 9 months, 9 weeks, 9 teams, 3 countries, bounce. And they had world-class technology. They had an IT organization. They had an organization supporting the organization of that scale. So I guess question number 2 here is maybe a bit too binary. Is it a people problem or a technical problem? Maybe it's a process problem. Amy, what do you think?
I think ultimately every question around data has to come back to people. The technical solutions are always an enabler of that. And from what I've seen, where people are enabled to better use data and have the right level of data literacy to be able to say, this is where I can use data to make my day-to-day life very easy, then you see this gap actually narrowing, where people continue to be somewhat cynical, somewhat apprehensive about using data to support their decision-making, then that gap tends to widen. So for me, it's ultimately always a people problem. If you could say problem, maybe that's a little bit too negative, but it is a case of how willing people are to adapt and how willing people are to break down this business versus technical mentality and find somewhere in the middle, which is where the real value is.
Yeah, I'd love to acknowledge the author of this quote, but I just can't remember. He said that people, process, and technology, if those are the 3 things, you often see that triangular diagram, right? He said it's not an equilateral triangle, it's an isosceles triangle, and people is the longest part. Caroline, do you know the one I'm talking about? It must be.
No, I've never heard that. I just smiled because it's really good.
So Caroline, round us off here. I'm trying to get from this place of woolly, foggy definition of data-driven, and now we're kind of getting into the delivery of information, going from data to information to wisdom to decision. Now we're kind of getting into like how decisions get made at scale. How does more than one person, how do teams, how do organizations make decisions, and the support systems that provision that information, whether it's a data pipeline or dashboard or whatever it is. Can you help us clarify our thinking as we move from this place of an us versus them mentality to a you and me versus the problem mentality, and actually making that part of ways of working and overall improving data literacy?
Yeah,
Sorry, it's a tough
lots
question
of
to
thoughts.
parse.
Yeah, no, I have lots of thoughts. First of all, I wanted to recommend to everybody on this call a podcast I listen to religiously called wait, hold on, what is it called? I think it's called the Experiencing Data Podcast. And it's run by a guy called Brian T. O'Neill, who bills himself as like the UX guy for data products. And it is really all about how to design data stuff that solves problems for end users and doesn't end up in just another dashboard graveyard, which is so much of where data work ends up. And I've gotten a lot out of that from him. And one of the things that he talks about that is like it's like a founding principle is design with users, not for users. And I think that's kind of what you were saying, Frank, is like the breaking the us versus them. And actually, I think one of the key things around that is like how you get enough stakeholder engagement to be able to do that. Because mostly people are really busy and off doing things. And so again, because we build a lot of, like propensity models and things like that for sales teams, one of the things that that we do before I think it's all about like, don't leave it till the end. Bring all that stuff, like why are we building this? All that classic like product approach. So why are we doing this? What does success like? What is the definition of done? Who are the stakeholders? How do you get them on board? Like all that stuff. And especially, what is the problem that we are trying to solve for end users, and how is our solution going to do that? So that they're not handed a data thing. They're not handed like a spreadsheet or a dashboard. They are handed a solution to their problem. And maybe that just means understanding how the dashboard is going to be integrated into their Monday morning sales planning meeting, but doing that so that like the design of the dashboard invites that, or that you're helping with that. And I guess, yeah, it's just getting enough buy-in from your business sponsor to make sure that those people, like those stakeholders or end users in your design squad, like data product design squad, are free to do that for 2 or 3 hours a week so that they can design with, and you're not just like getting them for 15 minutes every 2 weeks.
I think you're tapping into something really important here, which is when we looked at this sort of, the root cause, or we do like the sort of 5 whys question behind what's the blocker between the business and the tech and data team. It's probably this this lack of understanding of how the business has expressed how it wants to create the value, and how the data or technology team is providing the infrastructure and tooling to get to that value, or to get to that particular use case. And while solutions architects are great at bridging that gap in the early stage, you've tapped into something really powerful here. And Darren picked up on it too. Data products. Applying a product thinking and a product design mentality to the things that require decisioning, the things that require automation, the things that require that bit of clarity that says this is how a user is going to interface with this data source or this application or this model. So maybe UX and product management thinking applied to the systems is a great way of making teams or organizations more data-driven on the whole. And I often tie this back into automation use cases. I mean, Darren and then Amy, what has been the role of things like UX or data product design? Amy first, because you're deep into this with Zeiss. How have you engaged with non-technical stakeholders? Has it been a design type engagement, or a big long spreadsheet with a list of technical requirements expected from the business?
I mean, honestly, it's a mixture of both. I think this long list of requirements is a good thing to capture as an artifact, just to have this very clearly defined idea of what is expected and just to manage expectations. But this design UX approach, I think, is also super valuable. It's something that's hard to find time and space for. It's also hard to find people with the right knowledge, because UX researchers tend to not sit within a data team. They don't sit in a business team. They're usually in another team, and you can try to pull them into your team as much as possible. But realistically, what it comes down to is the type of research techniques that they apply. So it's asking not what the business, sorry to use that terminology, but it's not a case of what they need or what they express as a need. they can't communicate that. So you have to somehow articulate, to read between the lines in terms of where they're coming from, what's their level of data literacy, and what is actually useful for them. Why do they want, if they request a dashboard, what are they actually going to use that dashboard for? And that's kind of an iterative process that isn't always easy to do. But applying the methodologies and frameworks from UX research is actually super valuable in that regard, because you really get to the root of what you're trying to do, what people are saying when they say data-driven. You turn that into what that actually means for them, which is super valuable. But it's not a one and done process. It's not a case that you can have one 15-minute conversation and you have a clear idea. It's something that you need to iterate on over time. So it's super valuable, but also finding the time and finding the resources to do that, that's a real challenge.
Yeah, I think that's great how we're sort of moving beyond the symptoms, how to address the root cause. And it's so interesting we've picked up on three things that have almost got nothing to do with data and everything to do with being data-driven at the same time. Darren's point around data product and product management or product data product thinking, Caroline's point around UX and really getting into this design thinking process, and Alad talking about gathering evidence for prototype MVP version 1 with that whole lean startup loop. These three things have got nothing to do with data and everything to do with being data driven. And I think that's a wonderful closing point. Darren, Caroline would like to acknowledge that, yes, she has been on this infamous podcast before, James, that is rightly pointed out. But you know what? I love this podcast as well, so I'd happily put my stamp on it. So also, just a point of order, Mr. Chairman. Everyone on here has access to the chat box. If you've found useful resources, a blog, a link, an article, a book, put your recommendation in here. I want to encourage some peer exchange knowledge, and it shouldn't all come from the panel. If you have a great book or a great resource on this, pop it in the chat box and share that. All of your peers, although anonymous, will be able to see the links and things. But when you click on the chat box, make sure you direct the message not just to the host and panelists, but change it to everyone. I think we might crowdsource ourselves to a top 10 or a top 50 resources list by the end of this. Darren, round us off here. Final question to you. Ways of working to become more data-driven.
So,
what does that mean?
Yeah. No, that's a really good question. And as I was hearing from the other panelists as well, it really got me thinking, to see this in real life and understand this as an analogy that could be understood by a broader audience. I'm thinking of F1 teams. So you have the F1 driver, who's the business. You're sitting in the hot seat, you're driving at 250 miles per hour and all the G-forces and so on. But there's terabytes of data, lots of telemetry that's coming in real time. Now, we talked about what is the quality or the value of the dashboard and the UX and how's that communicated. Those key points are communicated at the right time to the driver. And I know not every organization wants to become like F1, but I think there are some interesting interesting principles to learn and communicating that, boiling it down to what is time to value, as Caroline has mentioned. And obviously, working with key technical stakeholders like Alad to actually make that pipeline, that insight and that action on the insight possible with the right time frame for your organization.
That just rounds it off beautifully, right? 5 terabytes of sensor telemetry emailed as a spreadsheet to Kimi Räikkönen or Lando. That's not going to help them get around the corners faster at 250 miles an hour. But in the grand scheme of things, the production, the analysis, the processing of that data actually drives Caroline's point, which is get to the outcome, which is winning the race, coming first. Wow, this is going to make waves. This has been a very interesting part two. Let me pause for 30 seconds and open it up to the floor again. Attendees, ladies and gentlemen, how are we doing? Keep going on this direction? Want us to speed up or slow down a little bit?
I think there's a question in the chat.
Oh, is there? Alex, I want to hear stories where organizations have used data effectively to empower a wider audience and how they do it. Any other anecdotes and panelists have, I'd love to hear. Okay, that's a great question. Let's take 30 seconds each after 60 seconds of reflection, because I can't think that quick.
I can start if that's
Yeah,
okay.
go for it, Dan.
So I think there's an interesting use case around public sector organizations who are trying to understand data that's available out there to inform policy. So I previously worked with city councils in trying to understand job market data in order to influence policy around funding education for the local community to make sure that skill sets are aligned and upskilling in the right areas. I think, you know, the public sector is you know, there needs to be more of a spotlight in how data is being used in those organizations, as its value in a slightly different sense. Not all of them necessarily work for profit, but actually for impact.
I'll go second then. My wife and I run an at-home blood testing company for fertility patients. We're trying to make it a lot less taboo. 1 in 6 people have infertility, according to the World Health Organization, but it's still a really hidden disease or condition when you're starting a family. Your GP won't see you until after you've been trying to conceive unsuccessfully for 12 months. And even then, it takes about 3 years to get to a diagnosis because of fragmented healthcare systems. So you're left with questions like, am I too old? Should I consider IVF? What is the cause of my disease? Will I ever be able to have children? The use case that we worked on that's really data-driven and very specific to patients in need is actually we've looked at over 1.4 million anonymized patient outcomes, patient records, basically, from the regulator going back over the last 20 years and packaged that in a really simple way so that any person, male or female, couple, whomever you are, you can say, I'm this age, I've had these symptoms, I believe I have this underlying diagnosis. What are my chances? We call it the Men Like Me or the Women Like Me report. What are my chances and what treatment is going to work best for me? And we've seen, I've actually borrowed this example from research that I did a few years ago on prostate cancer. What are data science techniques that we can use from historical outcomes data packaged up into a predictive model with a high degree of accuracy, and that's broadcast to millions of patients. Taking 1 million outcomes records and packaging it up into a GN network or deep learning model, and then being able to do things like a random forest model for a binary classification problem, live birth, yes or no, and then you add in all these dimensions. That's really complicated, but all of that sits beneath the iceberg. What the patient wants to know is the data accurate? Can I ask it questions? And will this give me more peace of mind knowing that I can't speak to a doctor for over a year? So that was a use case where we're using data effectively to empower a much wider audience. And it's also something very close to home after what my wife and I have gone through. So that's I guess that's a healthcare use case. It's not as flash as Formula One, but it's a good example. Caroline, Amy, Aled, you've got some use cases here for Alex.
I definitely, yeah, I can offer some. So same luxury automotive retailer. This is something we do quite a bit of, is like within Salesforce, using data to essentially make curated to-do lists for sales reps. And again, right, like initially the prototype, I think, was in Tableau dashboards and stuff, but like sales teams do not have time to go log in to a separate website where they don't remember their login because it's not single sign-on or whatever. So that integration into the environment where the sales team is already working is really important. And I think the really important thing is making it actionable. So it's not just here's a propensity model. You know, this customer is in propensity to buy this, I don't know, the new electric vehicle. Okay, well, what is the salesperson supposed to do? Like call up the prospect and say, my algorithm says that you're in high propensity for the electric vehicle. And this was actually one of the issues we had in the beginning, was like, well, how is that actionable for the dealer? What are they supposed to say on the telephone? And so we actually shifted it to be, instead of a propensity score, an engagement score, which was a simpler model. It was more explainable. It wasn't black boxy. It wasn't data sciencey. And we were able to co-design it with the regional heads, because engagement actually looks different in different regions. Because in China, they don't use email, whereas in the US and Europe, they do. Right. And so with that kind of regional nuance and really bringing the dealers onto the journey in like what that solution looked like, it looked like it was a lot more actionable, because it would say, oh, you know, this is the overall engagement score. Here's how it breaks down per channel. Send them an email, or invite their do a service on their car. Invite them in, and that's a great excuse to then lend them the electric vehicle as a loaner to test it to see if maybe they want to buy.
Do you have any links or examples to that use case?
Links or examples? I mean, probably on our website, but it made like tens and like, I think 42 million was the figure. So like very significant revenue.
I think that's an extremely powerful and practical use case. I'm trying to find some links and key takeaways for the panelists afterwards. Amy, data to empower a wider audience, that must be right up your street.
Yeah, so I was also going to pick up on the healthcare related aspects of that, because I've previously worked in a company which did focus on increasing levels of access to patients to certain data relating to management of long-term incurable illnesses, such as MS, such as Crohn's disease, where there is this sudden shift for people who've never necessarily looked to data, looked to research studies, and suddenly they get a diagnosis of this long-term incurable disease where the main focus is on managing symptoms over a long period of time. Then they switch to seeing how they can manage that, what they can do in terms of medications, what they can do in terms of lifestyle interventions. And looking at that from the patient perspective, you see research studies, you see certain clinical trial results, you see this in a very fragmented way. What you don't see is a picture of all of these together, this longitudinal data in terms of how a certain series of medication, a certain series of treatments actually impacts long-term patient outcomes in terms of managing the symptoms and life expectancy. And not having that visibility in terms of what people do and what is successful, what is not successful in terms of managing these conditions, it's just a black box, and it's an intentional black box because of concerns around privacy, particularly related to healthcare. There is just a certain lack of transparency and willingness to share this, but actually looking at these trends over time is so valuable and so interesting to people suffering from these incurable conditions, and giving them access to that, giving doctors access to that, it helps them to better inform treatment plans, informs long-term patient outcomes. And to me, that's an incredible use case. It's maybe the same as yours, Frank, maybe I'm being repetitive, but it's just so valuable to so many people. And it's not something which is appreciated, because I think it's not something that is thought about until people face these kind of long-term conditions and outcomes.
Yeah, by the time you've got sick, the data is too late. We've got 9 minutes left. Forgive me, Ella, I would love to tap into your experience on this, but I'd like to move us on to the final part. But we're riffing a little bit here, but I think these are really practical examples. F1, climate data, healthcare data, making things actionable for salespeople that has actually driven, multi-million-dollar performance from Caroline. I think that's good. The evolving role of data and solutions architects. At the end of the day, we're here. Our thesis has evolved a little bit to look at design thinking, lean startup, UX, and data products. These are all tied into the how, but I want to get into the what. So, Aled, you're an engineer's engineer. Does that make you a bit of a bridge builder between other engineers who are fed up with the business throwing unclear requirements over the fence? Or you've also stepped in as business unit director, so you understand, you carry a P&L as well as a professional services responsibility. How are you How are you finding yourself in that bridge builder role?
Yeah, so looking at the clients we're working with, then coming in, we're absolutely in that bridge building. We're trying to help them figure out what the technical solution is to solve those business problems. But I think that like thinking about how, say, the chief data officer and the IT department work together, and how do you build bridges between that. So if we think of the analogy that's sometimes given is the IT team look after the bucket, and the data officer looks after the water that's in that bucket. Which, if you're talking about them having to work together, is a fair analogy. But I really don't like that analogy because it makes it sound all too simple. Like a bucket is a really simple piece of technology, whereas actually the pipelines and what you're trying to create there is incredibly complicated and needs to actually keep on changing. And the water, well, it's not like I turn on the tap and I get some water out as my data and that's me solved my problem because I can have a drink. You need to get the right piece of data out and search through a whole load of things. It's a really, really complicated problem for the that chief data officer to work with IT and to then solve the problem properly. And that need to do like proper storytelling with the business to go, what could we potentially do with this data? What's the art of the possible? And bring everyone along on that journey, because we're going to ask a lot of them to improve their data quality and change the way they're working to make that data available, or to change their products to incorporate that data. And if we can't convince people of the value that that's going to bring, it's going to be very hard to make those changes.
Got this. I've got this image in my head of you holding a bucket, going backwards and forth to a data swamp. My God, what must smell in that bucket? Amy, deep into data governance, aka the architecture of good decision making, and Caroline on data strategy, the architecture of achieving a vision through data and data product. How are you guys finding your roles as bridge builders as well? You also have a technical and a business function. Do you kind of feel like you're business people in a technical role or technical people in a business role? Amy, do you want to go first and tell us how are you a bridge builder?
I would say, to follow on from that analogy, I'm probably more of a business person in a technical role, but somehow feels maybe the opposite in certain cases, depending on the audience and who I'm talking to. In terms of building that bridge, I think it's, from a data governance perspective, it's always a case of having this vision of how things could be, and always pulling that back to the reality of how it will be now, how it will be in 3 months, not to focus too much on what the optimal scenario is, because I think with data governance, there is a natural tendency for people to focus on an ideal framework, an ideal setup where the data quality is 100% perfect all of the time. And in reality, that's never going to happen. So for me, it's a case of managing expectations and focusing on what's really important, and then just building up from there. So I guess it's back to the product management focus, where you have an idea of an MVP and communicate that in the right way, with always having an idea of how it could be in the future. So it's just managing, having those two things in your mind at the same time, and not focusing too much on the future, but what you can do right now.
Caroline, just I can think of some bridges I burned in previous iterations of my career. Tell us how do you see your role as a bridge builder, and how do you see that role kind of evolving between the business and the tech? You definitely have to move between both camps.
Definitely. I mean, I guess it helps, like I'm self-taught in my technical skills, which I would consider like an analyst skill set with some data science thrown in. I'm an English lit major, and I think that already is like, I don't know, it's like storytelling and insight. And I think that is often the bridge is, okay, well, this is the data, this is the technical solution. What does it mean? And how do we leverage it again to grow and grow profitably? But I think that it's usually around, to Amy's point, just the multidisciplinary product team, and how you make sure to, what's the support team around the F1 driver that you put in at the pit stop. And yeah, I think you need subject matter experts who are giving you time, and users. Those might be the same people, but maybe not. You need a user researcher or somebody who's like understanding what the user needs are. And I think that goes beyond just like the requirements. It's really being able to think through user needs and user stories. And yeah, product manager, business sponsor, like all those people working together. And that's the bridge. It's not like a person, it's not like just me. And like, yeah, iterating through till you make sure that your technical prototype fulfills the right business problem and making sure you have that business case airtight before you scale.
I think in the previous role at a media agency in the practice, I printed out and came very close to framing this John F. Kennedy quote. Part of my bridge building was actually slowing down the business requirements and actually being a friend to the data engineers. And this sign said, ask not what your data team can do for you, ask what you can do for your data team. And it was just about rebalancing that power or perception between the two departments. Darren and Alid, the well-architected framework is outstanding at some things, but I almost feel that there's kind of this interpretative gap for how we do decisioning. What is the role of the well-architected framework for being data-driven? Darren, 30 seconds.
Yeah, I think it helps to put a bit of systematic approach to being critical thinking on the problem at hand. So well-architected framework has multiple pillars and it provides disciplines and principles around that. I think that's where the role of an architect can come in to drive some of those questions into those deeper waters and bring the right kind of stakeholders or people to take action on those issues at hand. That's my 30 seconds.
Brilliant. Alid?
Yeah, a lot of the advice in the well-architected framework is aimed at building those reliable systems. It doesn't necessarily say, like, what exact business problem are you solving, and so on. So, like, what you do with your data and what you're trying to achieve with it, I'd say, that's not so much the focus of the well-architected framework as more from the IT department's point of view. How do we make sure we build that thing so it delivers the reliability and security and everything else we need?
We're at 4 o'clock now. We're going to do conclusions and then we're going to keep this open for another 10, 15 minutes. Stop the recording so we have more of a private and protected office hours sort of session. If you want to stay on and ask our panelists one-to-one, this is a powerhouse panel and you probably won't get this kind of expertise together again, certainly not by tomorrow. So join me in thanking our panelists for giving up their time. You can pop your gratitude in the chat box since you've all been permanently muted. But on behalf of everyone, can I just say, Alid, Darren, Amy, and Caroline, thank you so much for giving up time on this Thursday afternoon. This has been a killer discussion. We've gone down different rabbit holes. Let me give you each 30 seconds each to summarize the key takeaway that the audience needs from this from this and the video that they'll be watching afterwards. Caroline, you.
We're here to grow things, not build things.
We're here to grow things, not build things. I like that. That's a very interesting. Oh, that's going to keep me up tonight. Darren, key takeaway.
I think don't underestimate kind of the role of a solutions architect and make sure that there is integration across the business. I think that's where, at least as an AWS solutions architect, that's what we try to do for our customers. And it's worked quite well so far. So happy to have further on discussions.
Fantastic. Amy?
I would say being data-driven isn't just about the data. In fact, the data is broadly irrelevant.
Shots fired. Shots fired. I love that. Alid.
Doing this stuff well is not going to be the responsibility of any one team or one group within the business. It really involves a lot of collaboration, a lot of stakeholders coming together with a shared vision. And that's hard to achieve, but well worth getting that buy-in from lots of people.
I would like to present Amy with the unofficial first place prize for mic drop moment and winning the internet today. Well done, Amy. Look, thank you very much. We're going to stop the recording here if anyone would like to stay on, but thank you very much.